They say you can measure a man by the shadows he casts, but I've learned that's a dangerous way to judge. Shadows can stretch long and dark even over the gentlest of men. That lesson began for me on the day a giant in a weathered Stetson stepped into my life and spoke words so plain, so bold, they cracked open the safe, quiet world I had built for myself. And before I take you there, let me say this. If you believe that the most unexpected stories come from the smallest towns, then you'll want to stay with me. Like and subscribe if you agree, because the truth is, the wind on the Wyoming plains carries more secrets than most cities ever will. I was standing at the chalkboard that afternoon, my fingers dusty with the faint grit of the day's arithmetic lessons, when the sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps cut through the chatter of my students. Redfern Ridge was the kind of place where the arrival of anyone unexpected meant something, either trouble or change, and I had stopped believing in change years ago. The September wind pressed against the wooden walls, making the old boards creak like a ship at sea, and the smell of dying grass drifted in through the cracks. I remember glancing at the window, the vast sweep of the prairie outside fading into that pale gold light that always comes just before the season tips from autumn into winter. 8 years of this view, of steady days and solitary nights, had taught me to find comfort in sameness. But that sameness was about to splinter. At 33, I had made my peace with spinsterhood, not out of bitterness, but from the simple arithmetic of reality. There had been a time when I had imagined a life with love at the center, a husband, children, a home alive with laughter. But those dreams had dried up years ago, like a creek bed in drought, when Henry Morrison, the banker's son I had once been engaged to, broke off our promise with a polite apology and an eye on more profitable prospects. That's how I ended up here, 3 states away from Ohio, in a one-room schoolhouse, mending young minds while quietly patching the ragged edges of my own heart. So when the door swung open and the shadow filled the frame, my first thought was not of opportunity, but of the disruption that would follow. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. In his hands he held his hat as though he knew how much space he already took up without it. Boaz Cutter. I'd seen him before, of course, everyone had. You couldn't live in Redfern Ridge without knowing who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. But I had never seen him this close, never been within reach of those steady, dark eyes that seemed to weigh a person as if they were a calf at auction, without cruelty, just a clear-eyed assessment. "Miss Wyn," he said, his voice low and rolling like distant thunder. The room fell quiet. Even Tommy Fletcher, who never missed a chance to whisper to the boy beside him, stared open-mouthed. "Might I have a word with you?" I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between politeness and curiosity. "Children, continue with your work," I told them, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp, a prairie wind tugging at the pins in my hair. Boaz Cutter stood with his back to the endless horizon, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. "I reckon you might find this strange," he began, "but I need a wife. And you need strong sons to guard your winters." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. A marriage proposal, if you could call it that, delivered like a statement about the weather. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Mr. Cutter," I managed. "I'm not asking," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, just truth. "I've got a ranch that needs a woman's hand, and you've got no one to look after you when the snow flies deep. This town's ideas about unmarried women ain't getting any kinder." His words should have offended me, reduced marriage to an arrangement of convenience. But instead, I found myself listening, really listening. It had been years since anyone had spoken to me without pity, without the thin veneer of politeness people wear around the unmarried and childless. "I hardly know you," I said. "You know I'm honest," he replied. "You know I work hard. You know this ranch can provide better than your teaching salary ever will. And you know," his gaze held mine, "that you're tired of being alone." That last line felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples reaching places I didn't want to look. I turned away, letting my eyes rest on the curve of the hills, on the shifting clouds. "Why me?" I asked finally. "I don't want a girl," he said. "I want a woman who knows her mind, who's faced life and not run from it. You've been doing that here for 8 years. That's all I need to know." The truth is, I didn't have an answer, not then. I spent that night staring at my mother's wedding ring, hidden in a box at the back of my dresser. I hadn't worn it since Henry left, Hadn't let myself imagine a life where it might mean something again. But Boaz Cutter's words had cracked something open. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was possibility. The following week, whispers wound their way through town like smoke. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile accidentally stopped by my cottage to confirm what she'd heard. Younger women cast sidelong glances in the street, some tinged with envy, others with suspicion. I knew every conversation would boil down to the same two judgments, that I was being practical or desperate. But on the prairie, where winter could strip a person down to the bone, practicality wasn't shameful, it was survival. And there was something else. Something in the way Boaz Cutter had looked at me on that porch, not as a charity case, but as a partner worth standing beside. By the time the October wind began to smell of snow, my decision had settled, solid as the frost on the morning grass. I took the folded marriage contract from my kitchen table, ran my fingers over the careful, educated script that had surprised me when I first saw it, and signed my name. Not for love, not yet, but for a chance at a different life. A life where, for once, I wouldn't be entirely alone. When I stepped outside to carry the paper to Cutter Ranch, the wind caught at my skirt, and the prairie stretched out before me like an unspoken promise. Somewhere out there, Boaz Cutter was waiting, and I had no idea that the man who offered me everything in such plain, practical terms was keeping a truth of his own, one that would twist this arrangement into something far more dangerous and far more precious than either of us expected. The morning I brought the signed contract to Cutter Ranch, frost silvered the grass, and the air carried the bite of early winter. My teaching slate was tucked under my arm out of habit. 8 years of my life distilled into that small piece of stone, and I carried it as if to remind myself of who I was before stepping into who I would become. The ranch sat low between two hills, sheltered from the worst winds. Boaz was by the corral, mending tack, bareheaded in the cold. He looked up, met my gaze, and came toward me with unhurried certainty. "I wasn't expecting you so early, Miss Wyn. I wanted to speak before school." I handed him the contract. "I've made my decision." His jaw tightened slightly, then eased as he read my signature. "You're certain?" "As certain as anyone can be about the unknown. I have conditions." "Boaz," he corrected, nodding for me to continue. "I'll keep teaching. Separate rooms at first. And I want your word you won't try to change me." He met my eyes. "I asked you to marry me because of who you are, Abigail. I don't want a different woman." 2 weeks later, we stood in Reverend Matthews's church. My blue wool dress was plain but serviceable. The bouquet of wildflowers Boaz gathered himself was the only ornament. The vows were practical, love unspoken, but when he kissed my knuckles afterward, something warmer than words settled between us. The wagon ride to the ranch was quiet. My room upstairs faced east, a writing desk set near the window, my few belongings arranged with surprising care. That night, over his beef stew, we talked about my students, his cattle, and the weather's grip on both. I realized he listened not out of courtesy, but because what I said mattered. Weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm, school by day, the ranch in the evening, shared suppers and quiet moments. Then, one Sunday, I took his arm as we entered church, and we sat close enough for our shoulders to touch. Mrs. Patterson's approving nod didn't matter as much as the look Marcus Blackwood, the neighboring rancher, gave us, sharp, assessing, cold. On the walk home, Boaz told me Blackwood had been asking whether ours was a real marriage or just for convenience. I felt the air shift. His interest wasn't idle gossip. It was the kind of curiosity that carried weight and danger. I didn't know then that Blackwood's questions would lead straight to the past Boaz had never spoken of, or that the truth behind it would force us both to decide exactly what our marriage was worth. The forgery fell into my lap, literally, when a folded paper slid from between the pages of a library book I'd borrowed to better understand cattle grazing. At first glance it looked like an old deed, but the ink was too dark, the script too careful, the surveyor's seal carrying the name of a man who'd only been licensed for 3 years. My teachers I had caught enough sloppy forgeries in students' work to recognize the real thing, and this was no accident. I found Boaz in the north pasture, the wind sharp and dry against my cheeks. When I handed him the document, his face hardened. "This is practice work," he said. "Blackwood's been perfecting his signature for years. My father died working this pasture, and Blackwood's been circling it ever since." That night, Boaz told me the rest. How his father had argued with Blackwood over water rights. How he died suddenly afterward. The whispers never quite loud enough to reach a courtroom. Blackwood's sudden discovery of an older deed wasn't just fraud. It was an attempt to finish what he'd started decades ago. We didn't have time to decide our next move. The next afternoon, Blackwood rode up with armed men, his words wrapped in the thread of widows and accidents. I stood beside Boaz and told him exactly what we knew. For the first time, I saw a crack in that polished mask. He hadn't expected me to fight back. When he left with an ultimatum, sign the pasture over by sundown tomorrow or face the consequences, we made our choice. We would not sign. We would stand. Boaz brought out a rifle I'd never seen, the weight of his army years still clinging to it. I took a pistol from the same case and told him to teach me. He didn't argue. By dusk the next day, friends and neighbors who'd long despised Blackwood's ways had taken positions around the ranch. I waited upstairs with a clear view of the road. The riders appeared as the sun dropped, Blackwood in the lead. The standoff was quick, the gunfire quicker. When the dust settled, Blackwood lay wounded but alive, the forged deed in the sheriff's hands, and the pasture still ours. Later, in the quiet aftermath, Boaz found me on the porch. "You stayed," he said, almost as if he still couldn't believe it. "I told you I'd give you everything," I answered. "That includes standing my ground." His eyes softened, and in them I saw it. Not just the rancher who needed a practical partner, but the man who, without saying it, had given me everything in return. The prairie wind moved through the grass, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the winter coming. I felt home.